American, and I know that there's so many that gave their lives for us, for our freedom.
Because he served our country, he deserves his rights to have a proper burial. I got a 2 shakes. There you go, buddy. Hope you have a great night now.
We believe in freedom. We believe in, honoring people who've gone and fought for that freedom and especially died for it, it's the greatest honor,
Right here, and it'll be as close as you'll be able to.
He was part of the greatest generation as a World War II veteran. The effort that the families went through to bring him home and everything that's finally come together, and this is finally closure here today.
This military, they're just grand. I can't say enough for what they've gone through, with us to bring him back home.
This is the moment for which we have all waited. It is a moment of ultimate joy.
Thank you, Father, for the many men and women, men like Lieutenant Ewart Sconiers, who've risked and even given their lives to defend the freedom that we enjoy. Your word says, greater love has no one than this, than to lay down one's life for his friends.
It's a miracle when a soldier comes home safely from the brutality of war. But some homecomings of a life laid down for their country are too a miracle.
The manner in which this journey has been led, conducted, supported by so many people. It speaks to a promise that our country makes to its service personnel and their families, and a promise kept.
This story is a mix of miraculous timing, hard work, and a dedication to the United States of America's bravest.
Right face.
We start here on a sunny January afternoon in 2018. A war hero, First Lieutenant Ewart Sconiers, was buried in his hometown in the panhandle of Florida, Defuniak Springs.
Ready, center, face. Ready, down.
74 years ago to the day, it was the same story, only on German soil.
Here, with track on an angle, going that way.
What happened to the remains of Lieutenant Ewart Sconiers from that day on would be shrouded in history for decades, waiting to be unearthed. Until Pamela Sconiers Whitelock, Ewart's niece, was yanked into the middle of the unfinished story in October of 2008, one in which she was forced to fill in the blanks.
We didn't talk about it. We saw the albums and the photos and the medals and the newspaper, all this box of newspaper clippings, so we were aware, but it was sort of presented to us. We never talked about it.
A soldier without a uniform, Pam led a group of passionate volunteers with a common goal: to see America keep its promise of leaving no man behind.
Thank you all.
An incredible team of dedicated individuals. Just the hours behind the scenes that have been dedicated to this search. As far as reading documents or looking through pictures, internet searches, countless hours, countless days, and it's unbelievable. Really, the amount of dedication and effort that Ewart's Army put into this search.
But the journey to get here was a seemingly never-ending battle that began while the world was at war.
From airfields on the continent and in England, thousands of airborne troops prepare to strike in support of the Allied ground armies which are raging through central Germany. Veteran American and British parachute and glider-borne veterans of the 1st Allied Airborne Army formed the assault force.
August 1942. America has sunken its teeth into the Axis powers, seizing control of Japanese-held territory for the first time with a successful landing on Guadalcanal and Tulagi. But Hitler is gaining ground. Nazi forces advancing towards Stalingrad, and Auschwitz is receiving its first trainload of Jews from Belgium under the guise of resettlement. Back at home, the war effort was in full force, and 26-year-old Ewart Sconiers had been eager to be a part of it. Defuniak Springs, Florida today is much the same as it was nearly a century ago, a tight-knit, hard-working community with traditional American values. Ewart Sconiers was born here in 1915. His mother, Maud, was deserted by her husband, so to help support his family, young Ewart began shining shoes at age 10. Though he loved school, the need for money was persistent, and he had to drop out of high school to be trained as a barber for income. In spring of 1941, he married the love of his life, Babel Wright. The two had met on a beach during the summer of 1939.
The very first picture we seen, of course, with them two, him in his uniform, and they're smiling ear to ear, and they're just, you could just tell they're just madly in love. He had to have been a wonderful man for her.
2 years later, on May 1st, 1941, Ewart and Babel eloped in Defuniak Springs. The young bride was encouraged by her new husband to continue school.
His major wish for her was that she continue her education, and she sure did it. And she became the first female graduate of the Auburn Pharmacy School.
But Sconiers' own attention to education was shifted out of focus as the world plunged further into war. He resolved to the fact that he, too, would soon join the effort, but he dreamed of what would come after. Sconiers wrote his brother Kenneth during his time in school.
Slick, are you able to mush some of your money in the bank? Boy, try to save everything that you can get a hold of. Learn what you can about motors, and after this war, you and I will buy a ship together, one of those double-seat Cougars. After the war, you and I will have a darn good chance to get started in Defuniak with what we always work toward. I'm going back to school, so let's keep our chins up and look forward until our day.
But that day would never come. In September of 1941, Ewart Sconiers enlisted in the Army. Sconiers walked out the door of his home in Defuniak Springs in 1941, never to return.
He is an American, prepared to accept his responsibility to protect and defend his nation and those he loves. That is the soldier's mission. He is learning to be part of a team, where every man's life depends on how well his buddy has learned his job. A job that must be second to none.
Sconiers attended the University of Florida, but flunked out of flight school. Instead, he became a bombardier of the B-17 Johnny Reb. Historian Marilyn Walton has studied the aircraft's role in the war for decades.
Because he had washed out, but the bombardiers did have a little experience, I know my dad did too, in flying the planes, but just the very rudimentary skill to fly that big bomber. Is a huge plane.
What training he did have would culminate to one moment in August of 1942. While on a mission over the Netherlands, his flying fortress, the Johnny Reb, was struck by German attackers. Sconiers had absorbed enough of his flight training to take over the reins and save the entire crew.
When he got into trouble over France and his co-pilot was killed and his pilot was so badly burned and injured, it just was something in him, the bravery in him, that he was going to get his crew home. Ironically, he flew across the English Channel, and if you've seen pictures of the plane, you see the windscreen is all blown out, and that's right where he was sitting.
Overnight, he became a war hero. Wes Gallagher of the Associated Press writing, a slight young Florida bombardier who washed out of flying school and a half-conscious pilot with his arm nearly torn off emerged as the heroes today of the Great North Sea Sky Battle, which saw American flying fortresses shoot down or damage 12 German fighters, although outnumbered 5-1. Stubble-bearded airmen who had not been to bed for 36 hours told how the gravely wounded pilot and the bombardier, who had never flown a fortress before, brought the big ship Johnny Reb back safely after Nazi bullets had riddled 2 of the 4 motors and killed the co-pilot. It was said President Roosevelt referenced Ewart's heroic actions in one of his fireside chats, and he earned the U.S. military's second highest honor, the Distinguished Service Cross.
A Distinguished Service Cross is awarded to the following named officers. Ewart Sconiers, 2nd Lieutenant, Army Air Forces, who was bombardier on a B-17E bomber on a high-altitude daylight mission on 21 August 1942. The pilot was wounded and the co-pilot was killed. Although not a pilot, 2nd Lieutenant Sconiers flew the airplane back to a friendly base and made a successful landing.
But his luck would run out exactly 2 months later. During the Lorient raid on October 21, 1942, his crew's flying fortress, the Johnny Reb Jr., was shot down by the Germans. Their lives were spared, but then taken captive by the Nazis. He spent 12 days in the cooler at Duleg Luft in Oberrussel near Frankfurt. Duleg Luft was an interrogation center for Allied airmen run by the German Air Force known as the Luftwaffe. Sconiers was imprisoned in November 1942 at Stalag Luft III.
It was a German Luftwaffe camp, so by and far it wasn't nearly like the Army camps, the Wehrmacht camps. Or certainly not concentration camp level, anything like that. So the Luftwaffe had a deep respect for other pilots, even though they were enemy pilots. They treated them with respect, and of all the camps that these men could have gone to, Stalag Luft III is the best one they could have gone to.
Though in prison, Ewart continued his letters to Babel.
Dear Mother and Bob, hope that I haven't caused you all lots of worry. If I have, please forget it now, because I'm safe and well. I'm just another grounded bird for the duration, it seems. My crew is all safe. 4 were wounded. However, they're going to be okay. Thank God for that. I belong to that parachute club now. I bailed out of the ship and did not get hurt. Kinda strained my right shoulder, but I was in a bit of a hurry at the time I put on my chute. We can't write but 3 letters and 4 postcards per month, so please don't expect more. Being a prisoner of war in Germany seems to end the war for me. Red Cross is good to us, so contact your Red Cross rep and send me a few things. I'll write more later. Have lots of friends here, and the food is fine. Don't worry. Give my regards to all. Love always. Eve.
But time would prove to be wearing on Ewart's hopeful spirit. Over a year after his capture, he longed for his home state of Florida. During a 2010 interview, fellow POW Paul Gordy, who ironically was Ewart's former classmate at the University of Florida, reflected on the depression slowly consuming Sconiers.
I had seen Ewart, and we talked and this and that and the other, and he came to the room, and he says, Paul says, can you walk some on the perimeter? He said, I want to talk to you. And I said, sure. Well, we started walking, and it was snowing, and it was cold. The ground was frozen. And I could tell that, first of all, he said, I've just got to talk to somebody, and I know you so well. I just want to talk about the University of Florida and Gainesville and the state, and we did. But he says, I'm so depressed. He says, I don't think that I'm going to ever get out of this place alive.
That conversation would be the last one the two men would ever share. The very next day, 14 months after capture, Sconiers slipped on the ice. It's believed that he suffered a ruptured eardrum and related infection that led to either meningitis or encephalitis, which likely penetrated his brain. Weeks later, in early January 1944, 29-year-old Ewart Sconiers died. In the days following Sconiers' death, the Germans asked 6 of his comrades, including a chaplain, to make the 2-hour train ride to the cemetery, a surprising sentiment on the part of the Germans.
I have to admit that I was impressed that the Germans made the effort to bring Americans, because they could have buried him anyway, just like this. But they made an effort to bring 5 American, or 6 actually, American prisoners including a chaplain. They produced a flag. Obviously, they did not trick the flag like the proper way. Probably they did not really knew about the folding and anything, but they made some effort to honor Sconiers. So I'm impressed. This was quite rare, I would say.
For years, Babel and his mother Maud believed that photo was a lie.
Because she had no idea what happened to him.
That they thought the pictures were fabricated of the original girl, and so did Mom.
But nothing could have been further from the truth, a truth never revealed to those who loved him the most. In the years after the war ended, the U.S. government conducted a field investigation in what, due to war reparations, became Lubin, Poland. But none of the bodies exhumed were identifiable as American. Sconiers' remains were declared unrecoverable in 1955. It would take 51 years for the case to be reopened. Pamela Sconiers Whitelock admits before she became involved in the search for Ewart, she was ashamedly distant from her uncle's story.
I knew my grandmother's grief from what we had observed with her, and probably the only 2 times I ever saw my father cry were when something had happened related to Uncle Ewart.
Pamela says destiny yanked her in.
We visited the U.S. Museum of the Air Force in Dayton, Ohio with best friends from Florida. At the end of the tour, I stopped in the gift shop, remembering my uncle's heroism and wondering if he might be mentioned in any of their books. Not only did I find mention of him, one book offered a full page of graphic pictures of the badly damaged plane he flew safely back to England. Knowing my daddy had never seen the photos, I was overcome with emotion. My friends wanted to know his story, so I shared what I had always been told. He was shot in the prison camp and thrown in a mass grave, never to be found. One friend asked if I'd ever Googled him. Why, no, the thought never had even crossed my mind. She insisted. When we got home, I typed his name in the search engine, and my life changed course. 2 of the posts were from an Air Force's forum site. One by a Polish man seeking information about Lieutenant Sconiers, the other by an American living in Poland who had seen a monument in his city's park with my uncle's name on it. A monument to my uncle? I immediately emailed both men. Within the next few days, I learned the photos of Uncle Ewart's burial were authentic, that 2 fellow POWs in the burial pictures were still alive, and that the government had reopened his case. Little did I realize that Ewart's army was forming, and a 10-year journey had begun.
When I first started working with DPML back in 2006, I was assigned the cases for Poland. We were going back into Poland for the first time, really, for cases since 1955 when the cases and they were closed. And the personnel that was still missing were deemed unrecoverable.
The fall of the Soviet Union and the collapse of the Iron Curtain in the 90s allowed U.S. investigators to slowly access areas that were previously off limits. Sconiers' case in Poland was one of them. It was an assignment he poured his soul into.
I'd like to think that if I was the missing person, that someone would be working that hard to bring me home.
As the mission unfolded, Pamela knew there was a heart still yearning for answers. In February of 2009, Pamela made a trip to Pensacola, Florida, to bring the news to an 86-year-old Babel who had been waiting over 50 years for an answer.
That probably was the most powerful moment of this entire journey, was sitting at her feet. But when I got to this question, what would you say if I told you that the government had reopened Ewart's case? They think they have found his burial spot. Immediately, this beautiful, tiny, elderly woman quite fiercely says, well, I'd say it's a lie. I know what happened to him. He was shot and thrown in a mass grave, and he's lost. And I move over to the footstool with the papers that I had now from the government, and after having gone to a family update meeting, and I say, Babel, let me show you. And watching her face transform and her eyes fill with tears, the relief, the hope, that also became the fuel for me. The next day, and she was 85 at the time, and I was surprised to get an email, She sent me an email. You've ended a 60-year nightmare.
In an on-camera interview with Pamela, Babel opened up for the first time about the loss that still burned deep in her heart.
When he died, just want to close my mouth. Yeah, I'm sure. Don't want to believe it yet. And it was such a strong bond. That's the reason it's taken me so long to get the story. And that's the reason I think that it hit me so hard answering your question. I didn't realize, because I had never talked about it. I'd never written it down or anything like that. But it was like when I met him. It was like it was a very strong thing that I never got over. Never got over.
For the first time in over 60 years, there was hope. As the case to find Lieutenant Ewart Sconiers unfolded, Grace says the roadblocks were frequent.
The biggest single challenge we had was the fact that our witnesses and people who would know what had happened during that time are dying at just an incredible pace right now. So it's hard to find people who had information about the burial or about the town or anything.
Who we did find was the man in this picture, General Albert Clark, a senior American officer held at Stalag Luft III. Though 94 years old, he remembered that January day so clearly, he illustrated it for the team searching for Sconiers.
General Clark had drawn a crude map for me with all my scribble on the bottom, and he sent me another one, and he gave me diagrams to give to Chief Gray and his team to take back to Poland. And he said where they stood and all that. He indicated that. So Chief Gray and his team took these back to Lubin the first time and tried to orient themselves as to where this grave could possibly be, because during the war, prisoners of war were always buried in the back, even a little small German church cemetery, they would always put them in the back in the POW section, isolated off by themselves.
Their research told them the cemetery was now a park turned over to the Soviets after the war. It would take years for Sconiers' growing army to begin digging for remains. Their first attempt in 2011 was unsuccessful. A townswoman told the story of a catalpa tree planted at the gravesite of an American officer. The Polish government allowed them to dig in that area, but the only remains found were of mental health patients, who were also buried on the grounds in the early 20th century.
This is a cemetery with probably 700 graves, so anywhere you dig, there are bones. So you cannot physically dig up the whole cemetery just to look for one person.
Szymon Swartka, a Polish researcher studying missing American POWs, had been looking into the Sconiers mystery independently years before joining Gray's efforts.
I think the biggest frustration was that we had the photos from the burial, we had German records, even the German death record, death certificate was available with the number and position of the grave. So you could think that we had everything to recover Ewart, but we're never able to move forward because there was nothing physically that we could correlate this information to. So this was really the biggest struggle.
Relentless in her effort, Pamela continued to push forward, this time with one of the country's best. Archaeologist Jared Burks volunteered his time to survey Allies Park in 2012.
I was used to looking for things that are thousands of years old. It's just in this case we're looking for one guy in this park in a different country where we don't speak the language. So it's hard at every level.
Jared, can you tell us what you're doing right now?
I'm extending our radar survey to the north up to the edge of the new road, and right through here there should be an original cemetery road. We found it just behind you there at the corner, and we're just trying to define the northern edge in this northeast corner of the cemetery.
Burke's eye into the underground was his surface-penetrating radar.
And it transmits radio waves into the ground, And when they encounter things below ground, big rocks, sometimes graves and coffins, tree roots, utility lines, the radio waves will bounce back to the surface, and it will detect those reflections. So it's looking for echoes of radio waves that are in the ground.
His survey would lead them to the second search 3 years later, in August of 2015, when the Defense Department's Joint POW-MIA Accounting Command, or JPAC, contracted him to return to Allies Park.
If Ewart is buried in the northeast corner, we would be standing on the row of graves where he's buried, basically right about here.
General Clark's memory, coupled with wartime aerial photographs, showed that Sconiers was likely buried 7 graves in from the cemetery's first row. Burks zoned in on that area.
So we proposed 2 trenches, one inside, one outside. We started with the one on the outside and found infants and such. There were no adults buried in that area. So we quickly filled that back in. We didn't exhume any of the infants. And moved over to the next trench, which had very clear radar signals of 7 graves.
They moved on to the second space, and within a couple of feet, the outlines of graves started to appear.
Then we had the backhoe back up a bit, and he started to excavate for the second bit of the trench and immediately hit bones, like right at the surface, which shouldn't be happening. So we knew something was going on right then, that the graves had been disturbed.
What they discovered was disturbing itself. Mixed up bones tossed in a grave together. Burke says it was as if someone removed the bones and attempted to put them back.
So there were parts of the first person below, parts of the first person above, and then the second person in the middle. It was really confusing.
Through all of this, none of the bones looked to be that of a 29-year-old male.
And it was starting to look like we might not find him, because we had found older people, women, infants, and we hadn't found anybody that looked like him yet.
Weeks into their search, the team was starting to believe the government's last attempt to find Sconiers was nearing its end.
This was the last-ditch effort. If we didn't find him this time, there was no going back. We wouldn't find him.
Days later, Burks would receive an email with a photo attachment that would change everything.
I turned on the computer, waiting to hear from Jared and his team to see what had developed over there. I typed in the same search terms I've used I don't know how many times: Lubin, cemetery, Sconiers, and every time I did it, the same things would come up, but this time a new website came up.
That website, billiongraves.com, was one she'd never heard of. A white cross in a French military cemetery in Gdansk, Poland, the cross bearing the name Ewart Sconiers. The name and the dates of the World War II conflict, but different from the rest of the cemetery's crosses was the omission of the phrase, "died for France."
And it didn't say that on his cross, so they knew he wasn't French.
But if this was Ewart Sconiers, how did the American prisoner of war end up in northern Poland in a French military cemetery 5 hours from where he was originally presumed to be buried? It was up to the historian to fill in the blanks.
After the war ended, the communists took over that part of Poland, and they would not allow the Americans in to claim their war dead, but they did let the French in. They just didn't like the Americans. That's pretty much it. They had a better relationship with the French, and they refused to let us in.
She realized the French took Sconiers as their own.
But we pieced it all together, and we knew that when the French were allowed in, suddenly they saw a Sconiers grave, which sounds a little French, but in case there's any doubt, they took him along, and they took him up to Gdansk, Poland.
And that's when the light bulb went on. It's like, oh, the French have been here. They're probably the ones who trenched across all these graves and disturbed them.
They were certain fate had finally found Ewart Sconiers.
Then everybody else got involved, the French embassy, the Polish embassy, the American embassy, DPAA, they sent their people over.
On September 8, 2016, DPAA exhumed the remains from grave 908 in Gdansk. The remains were taken to a nearby lab where Sconiers' dental records were available. It was a match.
I'd like to welcome you to the Defense POW-MIA Accounting Agency, known as DPAA, located on Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam here in Honolulu, Hawaii. And behind me is our facility, It's a beautiful 136,000 square foot facility. It is the largest forensic skeletal laboratory in the world.
Retired Colonel Johnny Webb is the Deputy Director of Communications for the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency, also known as DPAA. They're a division within the Department of Defense tasked with accounting for Americans lost in conflicts ranging from World War II to the war in Iraq. Ewart Sconiers was one of them.
We do everything we can to return their loved one that gave their life for our freedom for this country. And so we try to provide them answers.
The country's most skilled and tested anthropologists work here amongst the latest equipment to identify remains from around the globe. Thousands of remains have been identified and families have received closure because of the DPAA.
Identification, the techniques have evolved greatly since World War II, even since the Korean War. Primarily, in World War II in Korea, the only tools they had in the toolbox were the anthropologist and the dentist, and the information that they could obtain from the remains and from the anthropological standpoint and the dentist. But with the advent of DNA, now we're able to identify individuals that we could have never identified even 20 years ago because of the DNA technology.
There are three main pillars to the DPAA: locate, recover, and identify. A promise to leave no man behind, even after death, is not something many other countries do.
People just amazed that our country cares so much about one person, or one aircraft, or one crew, or one ship.
In the center of the facility is what Webb calls the heart of the building and the agency.
We'll come into this room. The remains of their loved one will be on this table. They'll have a chance to see the remains of their loved one, be able to touch them if they would like to. As you can see, we have drapes, and so we'll close the drapes, and they can have private time. If they would like to have that private time, say prayers, what they'd like to do.
They have nearly 100,000 cases opened for lost military personnel. Ewart's case was closed in April 2017.
Like I say, I had known Pam for many years. I had worked with Pam, and I knew Pam's dedication into bringing Ewart back home, the dedication that she had put into this. And so after all these many years of working with her, encouraging her during those down times when it didn't look good, that we were going to be successful, I really wanted to be the one that had the opportunity to share with her. I wanted it to be something that we shared together, to be able to tell her, we've got Ewart. He's here. He's going to be coming home. And so when I made that phone call, I think it was, both of us shed a few tears, but they were tears of joy that we had accomplished the mission, that he'd been identified, and he was going to come home, and he was going to be honored as he should be honored for the sacrifices he made for our freedom and for this great country.
It's overwhelming, joy, gratitude.
In the small town of Defuniak Springs, Florida, in the heart of the Panhandle, a celebration was in order for a hero's homecoming. A parade in downtown Defuniak, right in front of the train station where Sconiers departed to selflessly serve his country. The town of a few thousand gathered to welcome him home.
We ask your blessings on this memorial service today as we remember the sacrifice that Lieutenant Ewart Sconiers gave to help ensure our freedom.
Though Lieutenant Sconiers died long before many of these folks were even born, much of the Sconiers lineage can be found scattered through the blue-collar backroads and patriotic Main Street of Defuniak Springs. On the central stretch along Highway 90 is Ed's Restaurant, a local shrine of sorts full of Southern comfort foods, burgers, and shakes. At the helm, one of many in the Sconiers family line.
We've been here a long time, over 50 years my family's owned it. My grandfather bought it. It was a Tasty Freeze at the time, and over the years he changed it to Ed's Restaurant, and been here ever since. Been servicing this community for a long time.
Just a few miles away, the house Babel, Ewart's wife, bought for his mother after his death. The casket was brought here during the parade, a place he never knew his legacy would live on.
It's America at its finest. To this day, it just resonates. It just all washes right over you. And to think Ewart is literally at his front door is just surreal. And it's because of these Promise Keepers that just wouldn't give up. And he's home today.
In recognition of the ultimate sacrifice service personnel commit to make in defense of those values, America uniquely pledges another goal: to leave none of them behind.
On behalf of the President of the United States, the United States Army, and a grateful nation, please accept this flag as a symbol of appreciation for your loved ones' honorable and faithful service.
The community support in Defuniak yesterday was a bit overwhelming. It was far greater than anything I'd ever anticipated. They embraced this journey. They embraced my uncle's heroism and impact on their life. And their welcoming him home was genuine and passionate.
74 years ago to the day after Ewart Sconiers was buried on German soil, guarded by his comrades. Their descendants took their places to stand guard for Sconiers, who had finally made his way home.